While most Americans may not recall immediately from the dates October 3rd and 4th, 1993, anything in particular, most are familiar with the film associated with the tragic events of 18 U.S. soldiers in Mogadishu. A Black Hawk Down and a group of Army Rangers who abided by their creed never to leave a fallen comrade. It was a defining moment in an effort that had begun to fulfill a United Nations mandate to establish as soon as possible a secure environment for humanitarian relief operations in Somalia. That became a mission of the U.S. military in an aspirational operation that was called Restore Hope, that would deploy to Somalia a U.S. Marine, an immigrant from that country who turned out to be the son of the warlord General Muhammad Hadi, who would later, upon his father's death, become the president and prime minister of that country, having departed the Marines to become a warlord like his father himself. And when Operation Restore Hope had began, I was completing my first calendar year in the Special Operations community, assigned as a legal specialist to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and personally knew many, including our former battalion command sergeant major, who would join units like the 10th Mountain Division at Fort Drum, New York, to go up to Somalia to engage in battles against warlords in that divided nation in the vicinity of East and Central Africa that had placed the dark continent on the front pages of our daily newspaper in another time when Black lives appeared to matter in graphic, bold relief, but serve as a warning regarding the role of U.S. forces in the mission of being the world police. As you were. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, and for about 2 decades, my service to the U.S. Army spanned both our active duty and reserve component forces, with a few high-profile assignments in special operations and strategic counterintelligence, where, amongst other things, serving as the most junior commissioned officer to have ever served as the operations officer for all U.S. Army strategic counterintelligence in the continental United States, I had the unprecedented opportunity to play a key staff role in the formation of the Armed Forces Medical Intelligence Center, the precursor to the organization that George Stephanopoulos and ABC News had reported last April was supposed to have alerted the former president about an emerging public health crisis in the central mainland of China as early as November 2019. And perhaps you have seen images of the same. So for the next few minutes, we shall review the story reported by ABC News last year about some misinformation that had been reported at that time, especially by Stephanopoulos, who had been serving as the White House Communications Director at the time that that organization was being founded, and about which he knew or should have known, but chose rather to play politics during an international health crisis. Anyone in politics knows that the Posse Comitatus Act, and also reforms after the Watergate crisis, greatly restricted what can be used with intelligence information and also defense intelligence information. And I believe perhaps for a contemporaneous perspective to understand this story, it may help those less familiar with geopolitical considerations to go back to Africa, specifically to another international news story that had been emerging as I was transitioning in my military career progression from service in the Ranger Regiment to a role in strategic counterintelligence. In fact, but not for orders to attend the officer candidate school, I had been hand-selected to join a special operations task force to aid the U.S. military efforts in support of efforts to curb what by July 1994 would result in the genocide of over 800,000 citizens of Rwanda and the displacement of over 2 million refugees. But first, let's go to the ABC News report. On April 8th, Josh Margolis and James Gordon Meek at ABC News had reported that as far back as late November, U.S. intelligence officials were warning that a contagion was sweeping through China's Wuhan region, changing the patterns of life and business, and posing a threat to the population, according to 4 sources briefed on the secret reporting. Most Americans today, according to the Pew Research Center, only spend about 67 minutes per day, 1/8 the time they would spend in research for a new automobile purchase consuming news content. and only about 15 minutes actually reading news content, devoting only about 2 minutes on each story. And with practically all of their information being provided to them, sometimes fed through news feeds in echo chambers conforming to their political and ideological preferences. So we can assume that the reader of this particular story was more likely than not a voter inclined to vote for the current president, and that they probably at least caught the news headline and this beginning paragraph. So probably the impression that was formed during an election year after reading this portion of the story was that the former president had failed to listen to intelligence sources and probably did not ask at least the one important question. Why are 4 unidentified intelligence sources even speaking or leaking news to reporters at ABC? According to that news story, the report was the result of analysis of wire and computer intercepts coupled with satellite images. It raised alarms because an out-of-control disease would pose a serious threat to U.S. forces in Asia, forces that depend on the NCMI's work. And it paints a picture of an American government that could have ramped up mitigation and containment efforts far earlier to prepare for a crisis poised to come home. Analysts concluded it could be a cataclysmic event. One of the sources said of the National Center for Medical Intelligence, NCMI's report, it was then briefed multiple times to Defense Intelligence Agency officials, the Pentagon's Joint Staff, and the White House. Wednesday night, the Pentagon issued a statement denying the product assessment existed. The Pentagon issued a statement denying the product assessment existed. While the implication is that the Pentagon has to be covering something up, would you reasonably expect the Pentagon, regardless of who is serving as the president, to confirm that they have performed analysis of wire and computer intercepts coupled with satellite images, or essentially confirm that they had been engaged in covert surveillance activities against any foreign nation, friend or foe? A funny thing about spies is that they don't generally carry business cards to tell you that they are spies. And it is generally a good business practice to not get on television, national news, and admit, yes, we were spying, so adversaries can use statements such as these for propaganda in their countries. The downing of Gary Powers in the spy plane over the Soviet Union was not a good day for public relations. But don't worry, most kids miss that on the test. And the story even includes a clip from George Stephanopoulos' Twitter account poking bars at the Secretary of Defense, where he asks, did the Pentagon receive an intelligence assessment on COVID in China last November from the National Center for Medical Intelligence? And Defense Secretary Esper replied, I can't recall, George, but we have many people that watch this closely. Playing games with international crisis where lives have been lost, acting more like children than children. Should the former White House communications director know this? Yes, but what else should George have known, especially having served in that capacity during the international crises like Mogadishu and Rwanda? Even if true, especially in lesser developed nations, sadly, it is not uncommon for pestilence and disease to produce cataclysmic images of suffering and death. We are the world. And recall that prior to the declaration of a public health emergency of international concern, or PHEIC, at the end of January 2020, since 2005, when that practice began, the World Health Organization had declared 5 others that were generally limited to regional health crises in bordering nations, generally in locations, coincidentally, where there was great civil unrest and none had before bloomed into a pandemic crisis. The nuance suggested here is that some nations have a higher tolerance for public health crisis and may in fact benefit from these diversions from normal regional conflict and hostility. And it's always better than dumping nerve gas on your population. But in this ABC News report published on April 8th, 2020, the first sentence is probably the most significant to a critical reader. As far back as late November, U.S. intelligence officials were warning that a contagion was sweeping through China's Wuhan region. A contagion was sweeping through China's Wuhan region. A contagion, like an infectious disease, in a sovereign nation. On February 24th, after examining almost 56,000 from over 75,000 laboratory-confirmed cases in China and their tracer contacts by 1,800 teams of at least 5 epidemiologists, those clinical researchers in a robust inquiry had concluded that it is not clear whether this correlates with the presence of an infectious virus, finding less than 5% in secondary infections among close tracer contacts, less than 5% in secondary infections. In a recent report regarding COVID-19 reinfections, Johns Hopkins University, a name with which many associate with premier medical research and services, concluded in February, reviewing over 150,000 patients in one healthcare system with patients in both Florida and Ohio, that a finding of less than 5%, 4.9% in fact, had established that the possibility of being reinfected with COVID-19 after being infected was very rare, 4.9%. But the largest sample size tracer contact study to date on COVID-19 infection, involving over 3 million laboratory-confirmed cases in 2 cities in India, had found the secondary attack rate in that enormous study to have been validated at 4.6%. And recent reports regarding mutant variant strains from India now entering the United States are alleged to be 50% more infectious than that, or about 7.5% infectious. But when the Alexandria police were reported by Newsweek after the Scully shooting to have had a shooting accuracy of about 7.8%, it was deemed as wholly embarrassing. The flu has a secondary attack rate between 20 and 40%. There is no compulsory mandate to be administered an annual flu vaccine, like students at the University of Virginia, and at least 360 other colleges across the nation will be required in September, while smallpox is at least 60% infectious, a validated highly infectious or contagious disease. Both measles and chickenpox are 90% contagious, the most highly contagious diseases known to man. And regardless of what Dr. Fauci said about the Rose Garden ceremony, in addition to what he may have said in email, since the 1980s, every doctor should have known that a super spreader event is impossible without the presence of a validated, highly contagious disease, like even tuberculosis, which only requires a small infectious dose to cause an infection. It is of note that the WHO report on China, completed at the end of February 2020, had stated 3 times to protect the elderly in nursing homes, had stated in plain English that COVID-19 was not an infectious disease, and had directed world public health authorities, their counterparts around the world, to specific resources to protect the most vulnerable population, the elderly in nursing homes, who today represent over half of the over 600,000 fatalities in America, over 11,000 alone in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where Ralph Northam, the nation's only physician serving as a state governor, has been in command, and most recently appeared with the president in Alexandria to promote vaccine. On June 23rd, 2020, Mayor Justin Wilson and the city of Alexandria filed pleadings to state that this was not even a justiciable issue in a case that raised this very issue of the elderly in nursing homes. On April 28, 2021, Ralph Northam and State Attorney General Mark Herring prevailed in a motion to dismiss claims that a complaint about this issue regarding the elderly in nursing homes had ever been served upon them by the sheriff for the city of Alexandria, but admitted to the court that they had been annoyed by 40 emails to alert them about the complaint that had been filed against them. This briefing is unclassified. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb. Study subject, I bet you are. Maybe it's used?